Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at onpurposely.com.
The transformation that has happened in my life is when I see bumps now, I don't see them apart from what God's doing. God can still do a perfect, amazing work in each one of our kids and each one of our grandkids. And I am a woman who's believing Him for that.
We've all experienced it. You run into a friend from the past, but there's something different. They are changed. Maybe there is a calm where there once was a storm. Maybe there is gentleness instead of harshness. There's a new passion, a new life. What changed? Welcome to Brought Back to Life, a podcast where we explore stories of ordinary transformation.
I'm Meg Glesener, and above all, I'm a grateful child of God. I'm also a mother of 8, grandmother to 5, and the podcast host of Letters from Home. And a happily but imperfectly married mom. So, my story is one of salvation, persecution, and a deep transformation that God unexpectedly brought in my life. And our kids love hearing my story, how the Lord saved me, because it's so different from the Christian upbringing that they had. When I was a kid, I don't know if you've heard of the term ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, but there's this whole list of all the most horrible things that can happen in your childhood. And I have like 7 out of 10. So my parents started off marriage because my mom was pregnant with my brother. And so their marriage was loveless from the beginning. They were both raised Catholic, but felt super rejected. And so we were raised in this volatile situation. Really, I only have one memory of my parents together. And I was sitting, my parents were yelling at each other, and they shoved all 4 of us in a room with a closed door. And I remember sitting on the bed, and I could hear loudly that song, "Oh Tannenbaum, oh Tannenbaum." And I was sitting there trying to comfort my siblings while my parents were yelling. So that really does a number on a kid. My dad was also violent with my mother, then turned into this whole decade of living with one parent, living with the other. This one got divorced. This one was an abuser too. Oh, that's great. So there's alcoholism. There's, all the yucky things that can happen in a childhood were in various places in my home. And you can imagine that does a number on a girl. I was very insecure. I sought to be loved like anyone and looking for approval. And so for me, I kind of poured myself into sports a bit. And when I was in high school, I was really good at sports, but I was super lonely. And, people don't know, as a teenager, you're struggling with all these things and you don't quite verbalize them. One time I was coming home from a dance, and I didn't want to tell anyone I didn't have a ride home. My dad was an alcoholic at the time. I just waited, and I was just going to walk home all by myself, 40 minutes in the dark. And a friend of mine said, "Let me give you a ride." Turns out she was a Christian from Campus Life, which is a lot like Young Life. And it was in California. And Sonia said, "Hey, how are you doing? How are you really doing?" And I just spilled my guts to her, and I was sure I was going to be so rejected. Instead, she said, "Why don't you hang out with me and my friends?" So I started hanging out with Sonia and her friends, and they were so different and so nice. And I didn't really know what it was because I had only ever been to church once, and I didn't really know what was happening. And then one day we all went to a dance, and I went to spend the night at a friend's house after. And this guy, Lance, dear Lance, opened the Bible, turned to John 3:16 in high school at a party, and shares the gospel. I'm sitting here in my friend's big bedroom in the circle of teenagers, and he opens the word of God, John 3:16, and he says, reads it, "For God so loved the world." And he said, "Does anyone want to give their life to Christ. And I remember in my heart thinking, I do. I want to get saved. And I said, I do. And he says, well, you could repeat a prayer after me, And I thought, I don't want to pray out loud. And so I prayed in my heart and I gave my life to Christ that day. And when I woke up, I felt like the clouds were lifted. And this is coming from someone who had no spiritual reference, no idea, but I felt the Lord change my heart. I woke up with hope. I remember he gave me his Bible, and one of the people at Campus Life gave me a little dove pin. I started working at McDonald's. I had this little dove pin. I'd open up the Bible in my workroom, and I thought, I should tell my dad. I lived with my dad, single dad at the time, that I'm a Christian. And so I came home and I'm like, hey, Dad, can I talk to you about God? And he said, I'm the one who puts the food on the table. I pay the rent. There is no room for God in my house. And I thought, I don't think I'll tell him I'm a Christian. So I kind of kept it to myself. I actually got pretty good at sports. I got a full ride scholarship to Azusa Pacific University for volleyball. And my dad said I couldn't go because it was a Christian college. So I ended up going to Cal State Fullerton, putting myself through school. But it was there that God began to do a great work in my life. Signed up for a Bible study. And I started going and I was so excited. Somebody invited me to church and I asked my dad. I was only 17. I was a minor. My birthday's late November. And my dad said, Christianity is, I told him I was a Christian. So I finally got the courage to tell my dad I was a Christian in college. And I had been hiding my Bible when he'd walk by. I was afraid of my dad. He yelled all the time. And I remember hiding my Bible under the covers, but I thought, I was so excited, growing in my faith. I thought, I'll tell him. So he kind of gives me a 2-hour lecture on propaganda. And he said, Meg, I'd rather you told me you were on drugs than that you were a Christian. And just seeing the disappointment on his face. But I knew that that's what I was to do. So I asked him if I go to church. He said, you can go once, but if you ask me to go again, you are not welcome to stay in my home. So I went to church. And I think of that now as a Christian because, kids are like, oh, to go to church. Some kids, and I was so grateful when I went to church. I'm like, wow, I'm in a room where everyone's wanting to sing and hear God's word being preached. It was so great. I wanted to go again. And so I came, I told my dad, I went to church and I really want to go again. And he said, well, you know what that means, don't you? And I said, yes. And he said, when are you leaving? And I said, it was a Monday. Granted, I was a really good kid. I was the first one who went to college. I wasn't rude about my faith. I kind of kept it quiet to myself. And my dad said, then you need to leave. I left 2 days later. He didn't let me say goodbye to my sister or my stepsisters, which 2 of them got saved shortly after that. I moved in with my mom and, just facing that ultimate rejection. But now I was free living with my mom. I could go to church. I could read my Bible. I could do all of these things. And I just really grew in my faith. My brother got saved. My mother got saved at a good old fashioned tent meeting in California, Fullerton, California. I got to see God work in my life and many others. I got to disciple so many women. And I just figured that was my testimony. I went through such hard things as a kid. That's my testimony. I also met my husband, Mike, in college. We served the Lord together. And my last year of college, we got married. We got actually sent up from California to Seattle to plant a church. And our family started growing. And so for us, that place, our home, which for me as a child was a place of hurt, God was turning our home into a place of blessing. I so love serving the Lord. I'm not the person who had this dip where I didn't believe in God or anything like that because my childhood was so hard. I was so grateful, just growing in my faith, loving the Lord, teaching our kids the word. We had house church. We had ministry together, all these things. Our kids are teenagers and they're involved with Bible study at church. We've never had to make them go to church. They love youth group. They're helping out at the public schools, co-lead Bible study. And so the next part of my story that I want to tell you is a story of unexpected transformation. I didn't realize that I was just assuming that God was going to save every one of my kids. Like, can I tell you how many times, hundreds of times, I've prayed thousands of times for our kids to love him and walk with him. And Mike and I are a good example. Like we genuinely love each other. We're who we are behind closed doors as we are out in public. Like we have family devotions every day. Our kids like going and they participate. So I just kind of assumed that all the kids would walk with the Lord. Maybe they'd, marry somebody, at a different church. And you just don't realize that you have this idea in your mind of what you think God's blessing on your life looks like. We had easy teenagers. Then they start hitting the 20s. And there was a time 8 years ago when we had 3 or 4 kids having big bumps and struggles in their life. And some of those are not my story to share, but you can imagine hard things that happen to your kids that's out of their control, that's out of your control. You can imagine other things where kids maybe put a pause on their faith to see what is their life about. There have been bumps. And there was this one time when we had 3 or 4 things within the same week period. And we were at a movie theater watching Les Mis with Anne Hathaway. And we were sitting in the back with the theater department. We were in the last row just weeping. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Like, when you read the Psalms and you just think the Psalms are like encouraging and happy. No, there's so many Psalms where, David is going about with his tongue cleaving to the roof of his mouth and just eating tears for food. And I didn't understand what that was until we hit this place in our life where our kids are going through all these bumps and we couldn't sleep. And we're very at peace people usually, and we could not sleep. And we're moaning and just, God, what has happened? What is going on? And I realized that I was maybe just thinking I was living for this perfect little family here on earth. That's the goal. That's what God was going to do. That's how he was going to answer the prayers of our kids in my life. But as we got on our face before God, as we got on our knees and just didn't even have words some days, the Lord began to do a transforming work in my heart. Meg, I still care about you. I still love every one of your children way more than you could ever love them. And I am working. I am working. And the prayer that I pray for our kids, it just encourages me every time. Jude 24. Now unto him who is able to keep you from falling and present you faultless before the presence of his glory with great joy. When I think of that, God can do way beyond anything that I can imagine for my kids. And if it looks like they have a bump, there's a pregnancy in college. One of our daughters just visited our grandkid, Shiloh, which means blessing from God. She's 6 now. Can I tell you what a blessing that girl is? And we took her to church when we were visiting. And she calls me and says, Grammy, tell me what did you teach my mommy about Jesus? And so God can do way beyond what we can think. And the transformation that has happened in my life is when I see bumps now, I don't see them apart from what God's doing. God can still do a perfect, amazing work in each one of our kids and each one of our grandkids. And I am a woman who's believing him for that. And I also, think of the kid who maybe like me, when I see kids that are struggling in the corner, I help out with youth. And I see that one that everyone's like ignoring. That could be the preacher someday. So how has God transformed my life? Instead of being discouraged and hopeless and without hope, I think I have so much hope for that kid in the corner. I have so much hope for my kids and for our grandkids. And every day I feel a little bit closer to heaven. And I can't wait John 14 says, I go to prepare a place for you. And when I say that I'll come, I'll bring you to myself. And that encourages me every single day. I am living for heaven, for the Lord. He has been so good to me. I'm a grateful child of God.
We are telling these stories of transformation so you can know and understand the power of Jesus in your own life. If you'd like to learn more about Jesus and how he can bring you back to life, visit us at onpurposely.com/whoisjesus. And if you like Brought Back to Life, please give us a 5-star rating and a review. You can follow Brought Back to Life on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you're listening right now. You can also just tell your smart speaker, play Brought Back to Life podcast. I'm Sam Kelly. Rebecca Beckett produced this episode. Our audio editor is Scott Caro. And thanks for listening to Brought Back to Life from Purposely.